I first noticed him 3 weeks ago. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, and I was returning home from the library. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, painting the streets in muted hues of orange and purple. As I walked down the main street, my backpack slung lazily over one shoulder, I caught sight of him in the reflection of a shop window. A man, dressed in a dark hoodie and jeans, lingered a little too long at the corner. He wasn't doing anything overtly threatening, just standing there, but something about his stillness unnerved me. At first, I thought I was being paranoid. Living alone in the city, you learn to be hyper-aware of your surroundings. But as I continued walking, the feeling persisted. Every few steps, I glanced back, and there he was, maintaining the same measured distance. My heart began to race, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just going in the same direction. When I reached my apartment building, I unlocked the front door with trembling fingers and hurried inside. The heavy door swung shut behind me with a satisfying thud, and I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I was holding. I took the stairs 2 at a time to my third-floor apartment and bolted the door behind me. Peering through the peephole, I half expected to see him standing there, but the hallway was empty. For the next few days, I tried to shake off the incident. It was probably a one-time thing, I told myself. But then it happened again. This time, I was at the grocery store. As I browsed the aisles, I caught a glimpse of him near the produce section. He wasn't buying anything, just standing there, watching me. My stomach churned as I grabbed my items and hurried to the checkout. When I stepped outside, I spotted him across the street. He didn't make any attempt to follow me this time, but his presence was enough to send shivers down my spine. That night I barely slept. Every creak and groan of the old apartment building set my nerves on edge. I kept the lights on and the curtains drawn, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. By morning, I resolved to report it to the police. The officer at the precinct was polite but dismissive. "Do you know this man?" he asked, jotting down notes in a small pad. "No," I replied. "But he's been following me. Twice now." He nodded but didn't seem particularly concerned. "We'll file a report. Let us know if it happens again." That was it. I left feeling more vulnerable than ever. They couldn't do anything unless he actually threatened me. The following week, the incidents escalated. I'd find him outside my workplace, leaning against a lamppost or sitting on a nearby bench. He'd never approach me, never say a word, but his eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes, were always fixed on me. I started taking different routes home, altering my schedule, but it didn't matter. He always found me. One night, as I sat on my couch scrolling through my phone, a notification popped up. An airdrop request. My heart sank. The name on the request was Your Shadow. My hands shook as I declined it. Moments later, another request came through. This time, it was a photo of me from earlier that day, walking into my apartment building. I bolted upright and checked all the locks. My phone buzzed again. A text message from an unknown number. "Nice place you've got here." I felt sick. He'd been inside. He'd seen me. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. Calling the police seemed pointless. They'd only take it seriously if he physically harmed me. I decided to install cameras around my apartment. If he came back, I'd have proof. The next few days were a blur of anxiety. Every sound, every shadow, felt like a threat. The cameras didn't capture anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom window rattling. My heart pounded as I reached for the baseball bat I kept by the bed. The window was locked, but the latch wiggled as if someone was trying to force it open. I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. There he was, standing in the alley below, staring up at me. He held his phone in one hand, its screen glowing eerily in the dark. I grabbed my phone and called the police, my voice barely steady enough to explain what was happening. By the time they arrived, he was gone. They searched the area but found no trace of him. The officers assured me they'd patrol the neighborhood more frequently, but their words felt hollow. I was starting to believe that no one could protect me. A week later, he made his boldest move yet. I was returning home late after a work function. As I unlocked my apartment door, I felt a presence behind me. Before I could react, a hand clamped over my mouth, and I was dragged inside. My screams were muffled as he slammed the door shut behind us. "Don't make a sound," he hissed, his breath hot against my ear. My mind raced, adrenaline surging through my veins. I had to do something, but what? He was taller, stronger. I couldn't overpower him. Then I remembered the panic button on my phone, a feature I'd activated after the first encounter. I slowly inched my hand toward my pocket, praying he wouldn't notice. "You've been ignoring me," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "I just want to talk. That's all. Why do you keep running away?" I didn't respond, too terrified to speak. My fingers found the button, and I pressed it. The phone vibrated softly, signaling that it had sent an emergency alert to the police and my emergency contacts. Minutes felt like hours as he paced the room, ranting about how we were meant to be together. I tried to keep him talking to buy time. "Why me?" I finally managed to whisper. He stopped and looked at me, his eyes wild. "Because you're perfect," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I've been watching you for months. You're everything I've ever wanted." Before he could say more, the sound of sirens pierced the air. His expression shifted from adoration to rage. "What did you do?" he snarled, grabbing me by the arm. I struggled, kicking and screaming, as the police pounded on the door. He tried to make a run for it, but there was nowhere to go. The officers broke down the door and tackled him to the ground. Relief washed over me as they cuffed him and led him away. In the days that followed, I learned more about him. His name was Alex, and he'd been stalking women for years. I wasn't his first victim, but I was the first to press charges. The police found a disturbing collection of photos and notes in his apartment, all centered around me. The court proceedings were grueling, but in the end, he was sentenced to several years in prison. It didn't erase the trauma, but it was a start. I moved to a new city, changed my number, and began rebuilding my life. Even now, I still double-check the locks and glance over my shoulder. The fear doesn't disappear overnight, but I'm learning to live with it. And I'll never forget the lesson Alex taught me: sometimes, the monsters are all too human. It started like any other day. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long, golden shadows as I walked down the bustling streets of the city. I had just finished a late shift at the bookstore where I worked part-time, the smell of old pages still clinging to my clothes. My mind was occupied with mundane thoughts about dinner when a flicker of movement caught my eye. A man, cloaked in the shadow of a street lamp, stood a few paces behind me. I wouldn't have noticed him if he hadn't been so still, almost blending into the background like an unfinished sketch. His dark hoodie obscured most of his face, but his posture, rigid and alert, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I quickened my pace, telling myself it was nothing, just another pedestrian out for a walk. The uneasy feeling lingered long after I'd reached the safety of my apartment. That night, as I lay in bed, every creak of the building seemed amplified. My apartment, usually a sanctuary, felt like a cage. I told myself to sleep, to stop being so paranoid. But paranoia has a way of creeping into the corners of your mind, refusing to be ignored. A week passed, and the man in the hoodie became a recurring presence in my life. It was always the same. I'd catch him out of the corner of my eye, at the grocery store, across the street from my gym, even outside the cafe where I liked to read on my days off. Each time, he kept his distance, never making direct contact. But his eyes, those cold, predatory eyes, were always on me. The turning point came one Friday evening. I'd gone out with a few friends, trying to shake off the unease that had been clinging to me like a second skin. The city lights blurred past as I rode home in the back of a cab, my laughter fading as I neared my building. When I stepped out onto the curb, I saw him. He was leaning against a tree, partially obscured by the shadows. My stomach dropped. I hurried inside, my fingers fumbling with the keys. Once the door was locked, I pressed my back against it, trying to calm the storm of panic swirling in my chest. I told myself it was a coincidence, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I dreamt of footsteps echoing behind me, of shadows stretching too long. When I woke, drenched in sweat, the memory of his face lingered like a phantom. By Monday, I'd had enough. I went to the police, armed with a detailed account of every encounter. The officer behind the desk listened patiently, but his expression was skeptical. "Do you know him?" he asked. "No," I replied, my voice trembling. "But he's following me. He's always there." The officer nodded and filed a report, but his words offered little comfort. "Unless he makes direct contact or poses an immediate threat, there's not much we can do. Stay vigilant. Stay vigilant." The phrase echoed in my mind like a cruel joke. What did vigilance matter when the system couldn't protect me? Still, I took their advice. I installed cameras in my apartment, changed my daily routines, and avoided walking alone at night. Yet no matter what I did, he always seemed to find me. One evening, as I scrolled mindlessly through social media, an airdrop request appeared on my phone. The name read, "Watcher." My heart raced as I declined it, only for another request to pop up immediately. This time, it was a photo of me, taken just hours earlier as I'd left the bookstore. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just watching me, he was documenting my every move. I bolted upright, checking the locks for the third time that night. My phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. "You looked beautiful today." Terror gripped me. I called the police, my voice shaking as I relayed the new information. They assured me they'd increase patrols in my area, but the damage was done. My sense of safety was shattered. The following days were a blur of sleepless nights and mounting fear. The cameras caught glimpses of him lurking near my building, but he was always gone by the time the police arrived. It felt like a game to him, a twisted hunt where I was the prey. Then, one night, the game escalated. I was jolted awake by a faint tapping on my bedroom window. My heart thundered as I reached for the bat I kept by the bed. The window was locked, but the sound continued, steady and deliberate. Summoning every ounce of courage, I peeked through the curtains. He stood below, staring up at me with an unsettling grin. In his hand he held a note, which he pressed against the glass before vanishing into the darkness. The note read, "Soon." I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend across town, leaving the cameras running in my apartment. Days turned into weeks, and I began to hope that he'd moved on. But hope is a fragile thing. One evening, as I returned to my friend's apartment, I found the door ajar. Inside, the living room was in disarray, furniture overturned and belongings scattered. My friend was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as I called her name, but the only response was silence. A voice behind me shattered the stillness. "Looking for someone?" I spun around to find him standing there, his expression smug. "You should have stayed home," he said, advancing toward me. Fear paralyzed me, but instinct took over. I grabbed a nearby lamp and swung it at him, buying enough time to run. I locked myself in the bathroom, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. His footsteps grew louder, each one a harbinger of doom. Then, as abruptly as they started, they stopped. Moments later, the sound of sirens filled the air. The police found him hiding in a closet, clutching a knife. My friend was discovered in another room, shaken but unharmed. The ordeal was finally over. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, and I was left to pick up the pieces of my life. Moving forward wasn't easy, but I refused to let him win. It began like any other ordinary day, the kind you'd forget within hours. The sun was setting, casting the streets in hues of amber and crimson. I was leaving the bookstore where I worked part-time, the scent of old paper still lingering on my clothes. The day had been uneventful, shelving novels, recommending books to indecisive customers, and sipping lukewarm coffee in stolen moments. The city was alive with its usual symphony of sounds: honking horns, chatter from outdoor cafes, the distant hum of a street performer's guitar. My thoughts were preoccupied with trivial things: what I'd cook for dinner, whether I had time to call my mom. It wasn't until I reached the corner of Oak and Fifth that I felt it, a sensation prickling at the back of my neck, like the faint brush of a spider's web. I turned instinctively, scanning the bustling street behind me. Nothing seemed out of place. People hurried along, heads bowed against the crisp evening breeze. But then I saw him. A man in a dark hoodie stood under the shadow of a street lamp, his posture unnervingly still. His face was obscured by the hood, but I felt his gaze, heavy and unwavering. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if he was looking at me or just staring into space. My rational mind told me to keep walking, to dismiss the strange feeling gnawing at my gut. But as I quickened my pace, I couldn't shake the sense that he was following me. By the time I reached my apartment, my heart was pounding. I double-locked the door, leaning against it as if my weight could reinforce the barrier between me and the world outside. Shaking my head, I chided myself for overreacting. "You're imagining things," I muttered, kicking off my shoes. Yet the unease lingered, a shadow that followed me even into sleep. The dreams began that night, fragmented images of footsteps trailing behind me, a hooded figure blending into the darkness. I woke up drenched in sweat, the remnants of the nightmare clinging to me like cobwebs. It was just a dream, I told myself, though the line between dream and reality felt thinner than ever. Over the next week, I started noticing him everywhere. At first, it was subtle, a fleeting glimpse of the hooded man across the street or in the reflection of a shop window. But soon, his presence became unmistakable. He was there at the grocery store, lingering near the produce aisle. He appeared outside my gym, standing just out of reach of the fluorescent lights. Once, I even saw him outside the cafe where I like to read on my days off, his gaze fixed on me through the glass. Each time, he kept his distance, never approaching or speaking. But his silence was louder than words. It screamed in my ears, echoed in my thoughts. Who was he? Why was he watching me? And more importantly, what did he want? The police were my first line of defense. I went to the station one morning, armed with a detailed account of every sighting. The officer who took my report listened patiently, his pen scratching against the paper. But his expression betrayed a hint of skepticism. "Do you know this man?" he asked. "No," I replied, my voice trembling. "But he's following me. I see him everywhere." He nodded, filing the report with a promise to look into it. But his parting advice, "Stay vigilant," felt more like a dismissal than a reassurance. Stay vigilant. As if that could keep the hooded man at bay. Desperation drove me to take matters into my own hands. I installed security cameras around my apartment, changed my daily routines, and avoided walking alone after dark. Yet, no matter what precautions I took, he always seemed to find me. One night, as I scrolled through my phone in an attempt to distract myself, an airdrop request appeared on the screen. The name read, "Watcher." My stomach twisted. I declined it, but another request popped up almost immediately. This time, it was a photo of me, taken earlier that day as I'd left the bookstore. My face, frozen in a moment of obliviousness, stared back at me. Panic surged through me. I called the police, my voice trembling as I described the latest incident. They assured me they'd increase patrols in my neighborhood, but their words did little to quell the fear that had taken root deep inside me. The following days were a blur of sleepless nights and mounting paranoia. The cameras caught glimpses of him lurking near my building, but he always disappeared before the police arrived. It was like a game to him, a twisted hunt where I was the prey. Then, one night, the game escalated. I was jolted awake by a faint tapping on my bedroom window. My heart thundered as I reached for the baseball bat I kept by the bed. The window was locked, but the sound continued, steady and deliberate. Summoning every ounce of courage, I peeked through the curtains. He was there, standing in the alley below. His hood was down for the first time, revealing a face that was disturbingly ordinary. Brown hair, pale skin, unremarkable features, yet his eyes held a glint of something dark, something unhinged. He raised a hand, pressing a note against the glass before vanishing into the shadows. The note read, "Soon." I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and fled to a friend's apartment across town, leaving the cameras running in my own. For a while, it seemed to work. Weeks passed without incident, and I began to hope that he'd given up. But hope is a fragile thing, easily shattered. One evening, I returned to my friend's place to find the door ajar. Inside, the living room was in chaos, furniture overturned, drawers ransacked. My friend was nowhere to be found. Panic clawed at my throat as I called her name, but the only response was silence. A voice broke the stillness. "Looking for someone?" I spun around to see him standing there, his expression smug. "You should have stayed home," he said, stepping closer. My hands trembled, but instinct took over. I grabbed a heavy lamp and swung it at him, the crash echoing in the apartment. It gave me just enough time to run. I locked myself in the bathroom, my hands fumbling to dial 911. His footsteps grew louder, each one a harbinger of doom. Then, just as suddenly, they stopped. Moments later, the sound of sirens pierced the night. The police found him hiding in a closet, clutching a knife. My friend was discovered tied up but unharmed in another room. The nightmare was finally over. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, and I was left to rebuild my life. Moving forward wasn't easy. I changed my name, my appearance, even my career. Yet, the scars remain, in the way I double-check every lock, in the way I avoid dark alleys, in the way my heart races at unexpected noises. But I've learned something important. Survival isn't just about escaping the monster. It's about reclaiming your power, one step at a time. And that's what I'm doing, step by step, day by day, learning to live again. Hey everyone, thank you so much for supporting this channel. It truly means a lot. As a broke college student editing all my videos on an Android phone, it takes a lot of effort to bring these stories to life. A laptop would help me create better content faster, so if you enjoy my work, please subscribe and share. Your support makes all the difference. Thank you so much.